Namaste, friends. Wonderful sharing another evening of satsang with all of you. We'll begin as we always do with a piece of music. I'll chant for all of you. The chant that we will be doing this evening is a very simple Indian chant. The words are very simple. Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Om. Let's take a brief moment of meditation now, visualizing that beautiful, radiant form of Lord Rama. Victory to Rama, victory to the Lord. Tuning into His presence, His vibration. Om. Namaste again, friends. Welcome to another episode of Demystifying Hinduism, or the Hindu Way of Awakening, depending upon where you're watching this. As I've been doing these past couple of weeks, I'm going to start with a brief recap of what we have looked at so far. As you know, we are going through Swami Kriyananda's book, The Hindu Way of Awakening, as our guidebook for exploring and studying Sanatan Dharma, the Hindu way of living, the Hindu way of awakening. So the first episode of the series, we started by looking at the idea of religion itself. How is it generally conceptualized in the West, and how Hinduism stands rather outside of it, how the Hindu faith has been preserved through mystic traditions and not through theology and institutionalism. Also, some of that also exists in the Indian culture as well. And in the second episode last week, we looked at the idea of symbols and myths. What do they mean? Why do we need so many symbols? As we looked at it last week, symbols are a way of giving form to abstract realities. Symbols help us bypass the mind. That's what gives them the power. The power of symbols, as we discussed, come from two places. The first one is the attunement of the rishis and the great sages who express these higher, subtler states of consciousness through these symbols, through the deities, through the rituals, through the various images and sounds and mantras and all of that that they have given us. So we are tuning into that vibration through their attunement with the divine bliss. And the second is our own faith and our sincerity and our devotion to these symbols. And when both of these meet, when our own commitment and sincerity and our attunement with truth meets the attunement of the great rishis and sages who have expressed these truths to us in those particular forms and symbols, then what happens is magic. Is the magic of spiritual realization, is the magic of touching upon states or experiences or realizations that are not normally available for us on this plane of senses. We are able to pierce the veil of delusion or Maya and be able to become aware of subtler and subtler realities where truth can be revealed to us. Now, this week we are going to move on. But before we do so, I have a bunch of questions that I received from two different people, and I'm going to try and answer some of them. I'm not even sure if I'm the most qualified to be answering these, but I'm going to do my best based on Paramhansa Yogananda's teachings. And if any of you have anything to share, not just questions, if you even have ideas on how to answer these questions, feel free to write to me. I'll be happy to share it in one of these episodes, or you can leave it as a comment wherever you're watching this, YouTube, Facebook, live stream, wherever you're watching this, and I'm sure whoever else is watching will find them very beneficial. The first question, I'm going to read a set of questions. There are quite a few of them from one person, so I'll read them one by one first. The first question is a rather important one. I may have implied or covered some of these questions in previous episodes, but I felt it's helpful to explicitly answer them and address them in a straightforward way so that we are clear and we are trying to understand these teachings in the right light. The first question is Hinduism a monotheistic religion? If so, how do I reconcile that with so many images of gods and goddesses and deities? Now, that is a very, very fair question, and no matter whether you're from India or the West, that is rather confusing. So we do know, we study from Indian scriptures, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and all the Hindu teachings from the East, that Hinduism is in fact a monotheistic faith. Hinduism is talking about the one God, supreme consciousness, that which is the substrata of all of creation, this formless divine that has expressed itself through all of creation and permeates and pervades every atom in creation. So if it is the same principle, the creative principle, that is the Brahman, that is the divine, which is what we are worshipping, then how do I reconcile it with so many gods and goddesses and deities and images? It's a very, very fair question. Now, let me start by saying, yes, Hinduism is a monotheistic faith. Now, I'm forgetting the right word, English word to describe this, but because I just started preparing for this class this evening and I didn't have time to look it up. I remember a book that I read many, many years ago. I think it's called The Critical Survey of Indian Philosophy by Chandradhar Sharma. I don't have a copy of it with me. I couldn't find an online version to look it up. But there is an English word for what the Indian philosophy represents or reflects. This word is, what it talks about is how in the Hindu religion, although we believe in one deity, one form of the divine, we see that same absolute God in all the different forms, in all the different images. So that is a fundamental principle that pervades all of Indian mythology and philosophy. Again, there is a specific English word for it which is not coming to me right now. But in essence, I think the point I'm making is rather clear. In Hindu religion, as much as we believe in one God, we are monotheistic, but we see that one God in many, many, many different forms. Every form of the divine becomes a window into that same infinity, into that same absolute consciousness, and one can tune into it from any different lens. Now, still, it might be confusing, and what cannot be reconciled, or rather where it cannot be reconciled is on the intellectual level, because the rational mind likes to put these in boxes. From the level of the mind, if there is one God and that God is consciousness, who are all these hundreds and hundreds of deities and images? If they're all representing the one God, why do I need so many forms? Why are they related to each other? Why are they not all implying the same thing? Why do they all not look the same? And this is the part where we have to understand that the symbols themselves bypass the mind. They are not meant to be stimulating the same kind of intellectuality or theology that other religions or other forms of philosophy do, but rather these deities, these images are ways or doorways for us to be tuning into that subtler reality. So it is true that this cannot be intellectually reconciled, because this person, I think, also implied more, because they grew up in India. How do you reconcile the fact that now I'm worshipping God in the form of Krishna, or then I'm worshipping God in the form of Shiva, and somehow I'm conflicted? Now, should I be worshipping Krishna more? Am I being unfair to Shiva? Who should I be worshipping? Which form of divine should I be paying more attention to, or should I be equal in paying attention to all forms of the divine? Now, these are all very valid questions, although I can dismiss all of them by saying that these are questions of the mind, but that's not a helpful answer. But the true answer to that question is, of course, there's no partiality or impartiality on that level when we are relating to God, when we are looking at a deity, even if it's merely a symbol. It is reflecting that absolute form of the divine. All I can say is, when we are standing in front of Krishna, Krishna is the absolute divine. Even for those few seconds when we are tuning into Krishna and standing in front of that image, all that God is to us is that young cowherd boy playing flute, wearing yellow silk with a peacock feather on his head. That is God. God takes that form and God is standing in front of you. There is nothing else to it. He is God and you're seeing God in that form. But in the next 30 seconds, if you're in the same temple, most of you may have visited Hindu temples, this is what makes it all the more confusing, because you have sanctums for all these different deities all in the same complex. And within a minute now, you're standing in front of a Shiva lingam, where you're worshipping this round stone as the form of Shiva himself. When you're standing in front of the lingam, when we are standing in front of that form of Shiva, then God is Shiva. There is no other form to God. God in his absolute stature is now reflected in that Shiva lingam. God is an ascetic. God is on the Himalayan mountains. He is wearing a tiger skin. He has smeared his body with sacred ash, and that is the form of divine that is speaking to you in the moment. It is not conflicting. It is conflicting only when we bring this whole delusion of space, time, and causality, and we try to compartmentalize and somehow reconcile this with the intellectuality of the rational mind. But that in itself undermines the purpose of these symbols. So the only way we can approach them, the only way to make any sense of these realities, is develop, to cultivate that heart receptivity within ourselves to be able to see the absolute. And that is why we also have this concept of Ishtadevata, or your favorite form of the divine, in Sanatan Dharma, in Indian culture. So as much as you respect and worship and you regard all these forms of divine, there is the favorite form of the divine that is your friend, who you're always in communion with. And all of us need to cultivate that as well. Whether it's Krishna, whether it's Durga, whether it's Divine Mother, whether it's your Guru, whoever that is, the Guru is also a form of the divine. In a way, the Guru is also a symbol. The Guru is not that person, it's not that human body that walked on this plane for whatever time he did. He was not limited by that personality. If we're talking about a true enlightened being, my own Guru is Yogananda. It is the same confusion if you think about it. In fact, Jnanamata, one of Yoganandaji's highest disciples, writes about this in one of her letters of counsel that she writes to another fellow disciple who was asking this question. She talks about how it is confusing for her that her guru, Yoganandaji himself, is pure infinite consciousness. He is so outside of that personality and the body, and yet he is also sleeping in the room next to her. He's also talking to her with an Indian accent. He's telling her things. Now, who is the Guru? The Guru sometimes takes forms, and he does speak to us if you have a living guru, but in a way that living form is a symbol. The true guru is within us. The true guru is being reflected by that living form. In one of her letters, Gyanamata writes, the guru comes onto the material plane only as much as I come to you through this letter. I remember those words so beautifully because I think about them a lot. I'll repeat them again for you because they're so philosophically dense. She writes, the guru comes onto the material plane only as much as I come through this letter. The letter is an agency for carrying my vibration, for communicating what it is that I want to tell you, but the letter is not me. Similarly, the guru is that agency. He is the vehicle through which God comes to us, but the guru himself is not. The vehicle itself is not that guru consciousness, because the guru consciousness is beyond that. Now, I'm giving this example, although it might seem a little tangential, because it is true with every symbol. It is true with the deities, with the gods and goddesses that we are tuning into. Shiva is a certain vibration, is a certain consciousness through which the divine can come to us, the divine can touch us. But true form of divinity stands behind it. That God as absolute consciousness, as Satchit Ananda, is standing behind all those forms and names. Same with Krishna or Durga or Ganesha or whatever form of God that we are drawn to. These symbols speak to us. They are a bridge between the reality of senses and the reality of the divine. But that bridge itself is not the same as the reality of the divine. That's what we need to understand. And when we over-intellectualize, when we bring our rational mind into it to resolve these seemingly confusing aspects of it, it doesn't take us anywhere. It doesn't really help us spiritually progress, because that is not the point of these symbols. Now, moving on. Now, we can sometimes tend to develop attachment to form. Does that hold us back spiritually? Don't we need to transcend our attachment to form in order to make spiritual progress? Again, this is another very, very important and helpful question to answer. Now, by tying ourselves so strongly with symbols, even with images of gods or goddesses, are we limiting ourselves spiritually? Are we holding ourselves back? Are we holding ourselves from being able to progress spiritually because we are attached to that form? I'll share some stories with you. Maybe that will help answer this question. The simple answer to that question is no. If we are in fact holding that symbol in the right spirit and with the right attitude of mind, it does not hold us back spiritually. In fact, that's where we explored that quote from Yogananda ji last week, where he was discouraging devotees from practicing fanatical devotion, to be able to balance devotion with common sense, to be able to be grounding it with perspective and awareness, but still that devotion is practiced in a personal way. The first story I want to share is a story from the life of Ramakrishna. I'm sure in this series a lot of stories from his life will creep in because I'm deeply inspired by all of them. Now, Ramakrishna, as all of you know, was deeply, deeply devoted to the form of the divine as Kali. Kali was his Ishtadevata, and he was constantly in communion with Kali. Now, he's a great example because it is not that he didn't think of Krishna or Shiva or other forms of divine, but all that he saw in Krishna and Shiva and Ganesha and all forms of divine was Kali. Kali was manifesting in all of them because to him, Kali was Supreme Spirit. And that Supreme Spirit spoke to him in the form of his mother Kali. Now, a great Advaitic yogi, his name was Totapuri, and he came to meet Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was an avatar. He was a fully self-realized being. And this man came to meet Ramakrishna and said, I need you, I want you to experience higher states of spirituality that one can only experience by transcending form. You're too attached to external forms like this image and this relationship with Kali that you have. If you truly want to experience enlightenment, if you want to spiritually transcend all limitations and be in that state of perfect bliss, you need to be able to transcend the form. And Ramakrishna, the humble childlike being he was, he submits readily. He understands that this man was sent to him by divine, by Kali herself, to teach him whatever he needed to know. So even today, when you go to Dakshineshwar, if you walk outside the temple, just a 5-minute distance away is this place where there's a small hut-like structure. Back in those days when Ramakrishna used to live there, this was heavily forested, and there was this forest called Panchavati, in the middle of which there was this small hut. But now, of course, the whole place has been urbanized and it's pretty congested, but you still have that hut in the middle of this area right by the banks of Ganges. Now, Totapuri took Ramakrishna to the small hut, and he recommended Ramakrishna, he wanted Ramakrishna to meditate there, focus. And he said, you need to slay all forms. You need to bring all forms to your spiritual eye. And if that's how you're reaching the state of ecstasy, you have to go there and you have to slay that form with the sword of your mind. You have to use your discrimination to be able to slay all form. So when you see Kali, you have to take that sword of discrimination and slay her with the eye of your mind, so that you can transcend that form and go beyond that. So Ramakrishna goes into meditation, and he's there for 3 days. This is a real story that happened. This is not mythical. So Ramakrishna is meditating deeply, and he is in the state of complete ecstasy because he is with Kali, he is in Kali, he is completely having this divine experience of being one with Kali, being completely absorbed in her presence. But he is not able to take that sword of discrimination and slay her form. He is engrossed in her form. After 3 days of instructing him over and over again, Totapuri walks into the hut and he sees what Ramakrishna is doing, and he says, there's no hope. I cannot make you do this. I'm going to do it myself. And the way the story is told, he took a piece of glass and he cut. He slit open Ramakrishna's third eye, his skin and his flesh here, and blood started pouring out of Ramakrishna's forehead. And it is said that that is how that form was pierced, and Ramakrishna was able to go into a much higher and deeper state of samadhi. And when he comes down, this is where the story gets interesting. Totapuri thinks now Ramakrishna has gone beyond that form of Kali, and now he can see God in the formless state, and he can completely experience that bliss all the time. And Ramakrishna says, that was great, but now I'm back to being with Mother Kali. She's after all my mother. How can I be without her? And as much as he crosses to that formless experience of divine, he returns back and holds on to that form ever more tightly. And Totapuri at this point says, I have shown you the way, I have taken you as far as I could. Now I'm done. I don't think you're doing well. You're still attaching to the lower forms. You're, just as the question was phrased, you're still attaching yourself to the form, and that is holding you back spiritually. And now, as the story is told after this, Totapuri was disrespectful of Ramakrishna's attachment to the form. He was seeing it as a delusion of the ego, whereas it was not. What Ramakrishna was experiencing was the purest form of devotion, of being one with the divine, and the form itself was not an impediment for him to experience that state of divine bliss. That was the truth of Ramakrishna's life. And in order to teach Totapuri a lesson, the way the story is told is Totapuri goes to the Ganges, and he somehow immediately is overwhelmed by this disease, a terrible pain in his abdomen. And the pain is so terrible that he's not able to bear it at all, and he wants to kill himself. He says, I'm an Advaitic yogi, I have realized God in the formless. I don't need this body, I need to kill this body. I cannot bear this pain. So he walks into the Ganges trying to drown himself and die. And as he keeps walking into the Ganges, the river keeps receding. Totapuri keeps walking again and again, keeps going farther and farther. And the river, if you've been to Dakshineshwar, it is not a small river. You can barely see the opposite bank. It's a huge river, maybe hundreds of feet deep in the amount of water it holds. And Totapuri keeps walking further and further, and the water recedes, and it does not come above his waist, so he cannot drown. And then after some time he realizes this is the play of Kali, because he was disrespectful to God in creation, God in form, God with form and with name. He was disrespectful. So God was teaching him a lesson, and then he looks up at the sky and he sees the smiling face of Kali. He realizes that if you want to be on this plane, when you are an embodied being, when you are working on this level, it is impossible to let go of form, and it's perhaps not even right to let go of form. So he realizes his own delusion. He was thinking that he was going to relieve Ramakrishna out of his delusion, but in this story, Ramakrishna was an avatar. He was a fully self-realized being, and he was playing this leela of worshipping God in form and without form. But at the same time, the lesson was also something that Totapuri needed to learn, which is you can, in fact, reach the highest form of divine experience through form. And even if you don't need form, even if you're not drawn to it, you have to respect God in creation. That's why in the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna asks this question, Krishna, what is a better way to attain this divine goal? Should I be worshipping God in form or in formless states? And Krishna's answer to that is interesting. He says, first of all, Krishna states it categorically. He says, you have to worship God through form. It is the easier route. And he says, for embodied beings, this form of pure discrimination, of simply seeing the God as formless consciousness, is wrought with dangers. The dangers that we already saw in the story of Totapuri, because we lose that perspective, we lose that respect for God in all of his beauty and in all of his manifestations. So as Krishna puts it, for embodied beings, which I'm going to assume all of us are, we are all in these bodies watching these things on our computer monitors, we all need to cultivate that personal relationship with God through symbols, through forms, through whatever form of God that speaks to us. We want to be cultivating and opening our hearts. And when we are drawn to Krishna, when we are drawn to Shiva, we want to be wholehearted in that devotion. Just as Ramakrishna was, just as Yogananda was. Yogananda always related to God in the form of Divine Mother. He always was in communion with Divine Mother. He was always in a state of connection with God in the form of Divine Mother. And we all have to find out for ourselves, what is that form of God that I'm most drawn to? Is it Krishna? Is it Jesus? Is it Divine Mother? Is it Shiva? Whatever it is, it need not be a Hindu deity, it might be Buddha or whatever. We want to find those forms of divine and attach wholeheartedly to that form, and quite far from whether we are offending Krishna by worshipping Shiva or worshipping Jesus and Krishna less and all of this. The more we are able to tune into any form of divine, the closer we are taken to all forms of divine. That's the important lesson that we learn through these symbols. It's not that somehow when we are singing a song to Krishna or doing a ritual to Shiva, now we have moved farther from Kali. No. The more we do that, we become closer to Kali, because we become closer and closer to the truth of who Kali in essence is. It takes us into that devotional place where we can relate to that truth, relate to that reality from a much, much purer place in our own hearts. The caveat here is not to intellectualize, is not to make this a figment of the mind, to not to somehow taint it with our own rational mind and causality and reconciling this with that and all those understandings which are not part of how these symbols were made. There are a few more questions. I think I'm going to digress from answering questions. The other important question, I'll read the question, but I'm not reading this to tease you, but I am going to reserve the answer for this to a later episode, because there are other things that I want to say following up on what I was just speaking about. The other question is, did the mythical stories truly happen? All the mythological stories that we read in Hindu scriptures. Again, that answer is also subtle. There's a yes and no answer to that. I'm going to come to that later. But going back to this personal relationship with divine, that is one of the fundamental principles of Sanatan Dharma itself. And these symbols give us a way, they give us a mechanism, they give us this roadmap and doorway to be able to cultivate the heart's devotion, to be able to tune into these subtler realities, which otherwise for us embodied beings can be very complex. There are so many stories that come to me right now. I could just share them for the next 2 hours and it'll make a very interesting class. I'll keep some stories for later. But there is a beautiful story that Swami Jyotish, who is the spiritual director of Ananda, one of the spiritual directors of Ananda, who's the spiritual successor of Swami Kriyananda, who wrote this book, he shares he once visited India very early on in the 80s. He went with Swami Kriyananda and he met the great woman saint Anandamoyi Ma. Swami Kriyananda had a very close and sweet relationship with her. Those of you who have read the autobiography of a yogi, Yogananda ji also writes a lot about her. He dedicates a whole chapter to Anandamoyi Ma. And Swami was very dear to her, and he visited her many times in his life. And this time Jyotish also went with him. Now there was a disciple of Anandamoyi Ma who lived in California, and Jyotish had taken some questions on her behalf to Anandamoyi Ma. Jyotish first took also questions from other devotees of Ananda and himself, and he asked Ma, and she was very brief in responses to those philosophical questions, and she answered a little, and then she pointed to Swami, and she wanted Swami to answer these questions. And then Jyotish reached the questions that were sent by Anandamoyi Ma's disciple, one of Jyotish's friends. And these questions, as Jyotish himself shared in the talk that I was listening to, he said these questions were so far outside of anything that he can even think of. He would never in a million years consider asking such questions, let alone to Anandamoyi Ma, but to anybody. So he asked these questions with a little bit of trepidation and hesitation, and to his surprise, Anandamoyi Ma was giving such detailed explanation and answers to these questions. And these questions were, might seem silly to most people. There were questions like, this person who was a disciple of Ma was worshipping a small idol of Krishna as Gopala. There were questions about, what do I feed him? Do I take him with me when I travel, or should I leave him home? When I travel, what kind of food does he like to eat? And these questions seemed so silly to Jyotish. I mean, what kind of questions? Like, you're talking about an idol of Krishna you worship, but what are you talking about food preferences when he's traveling? Is he, as if he's a real person? And Anandamoyi Ma, interestingly, took every one of those questions seriously and answered them in great detail. If you're traveling just for 1 or 2 days, it's okay, don't trouble him, leave him home, he can stay there. But if you're going to go on a longer trip, he can be lonely, you don't want to leave him alone in the house like that, you want to take him with you. So make sure you make those arrangements and such. Now, I wanted to share this story because it ties so beautifully with the topic and discussion on symbols that we have been discussing and all the questions that we saw. Now, it can seem a little naive. It can seem like one is in fact creating an imaginary reality. One is making up things in their own mind to give life to an idol or to a statue. And doing all of this, is this all just for one's own benefit? Are we drawing something from all of this, but the statue itself is simply an inanimate object? Now, this is where it is not particularly helpful or useful to be dissecting this with the mind, because it is not a statue. It is a living presence. It is the living presence of Krishna that this person was worshipping. And the power, that presence comes into that statue not because somebody blessed it, somebody did a ritual, but because we start treating it as a living presence. What is truth? What is a symbol? What is real? What is the plane of senses? These are questions that become rather subtle. In fact, I read a book very many years back, I think perhaps right out of high school when I was going into college. It's a very famous book that I think it's The Tao of Physics. Yes, I think most of you may be familiar with that. And there's one argument the author presented in that book that touched me so deeply, which actually sent me on a spiritual quest exploring a lot of things, finally ending up with the autobiography of a yogi. The question that the author of that book proposed was simply this: we relate and perceive this world just in 5 abstract aspects. We can perceive this world only through 5 means, 5 doorways, through the 5 senses that we have. We can see, touch, hear, feel, taste. Those are the only ways we can feel a tree or a building or a person. But what makes us think that just because our perception is limited to 5 aspects, that this entity, the essence of this tree or this person or this object, is limited to 5 aspects of existence? It is arbitrary. Nothing in creation can be reduced just to abstract 5 aspects. We relate to everything in this world on the material plane through 5 aspects, and we start defining truth with those limited perceptions and that limited vision, but that does not define truth. Now, this is related to what I was saying with symbols and all these objects, because the mind that is constantly tainted by ego is also able to perceive only through the senses. Now we start defining truth through sensory realities. But there is so much more in this world that we ourselves start to perceive, start to become aware of as we are spiritually awakening. So who is to say what is true, what is not, what is a symbol, what is an actual reality? These distinctions are not as categorical as they might seem. The more we tune into spiritual realities, the more we realize that all of these become rather subjective. Jesus is a living reality to Saint Francis and to very devout and practicing Christians everywhere in the world. And at the same time, Krishna or Kali or Shiva are living realities to the Hindus who are worshipping God in those forms. And all of these are equally powerful. All of these are ways through which we can tune into the divine. It is very hard for us to simply somehow categorize and compartmentalize these things as either imaginations of the human mind or constructs that we ourselves have placed upon this world in order to relate to the formless aspect of divine. Yes, God is formless, but God is Krishna. God is Kali. This form of the divine does appear, again, going back to the life of Ramakrishna. There are all these stories that Ramakrishna shares where one fine morning he just wakes up and says, yesterday Kali came to me as this young 6-year-old girl. She was wearing this beautiful yellow silk skirt, and then she took me to the Ganges and we were playing together, and then she came back and dropped me here. Now, he was not describing a dream. He was not describing a vision, he was describing an actual experience. With his devotion, with his attunement, with his own power of faith and sincerity, he was able to freeze that infinite consciousness in that tiny form, in the form of that girl. The power lies in the human heart to reduce all these abstractions, not just to symbols that we somehow play with our minds, but to actual realities. These symbols become living realities, whether it's that idol of Krishna that this disciple of Anandamayi Ma was worshipping, that Ma was giving her exact details of how to take care, or it could be the image that you have on your own altar. I remember growing up, my own grandmother was very devoted worshipper of Divine Mother, and she had this particular deity and form that had come through in our family that she did puja for every day. And my uncle lived in Mumbai in those days, and we used to travel by train. And back in those days, I'm talking about it as if it was in the 60s, but I'm talking about the 90s, which is when I grew up. But in the 90s, the train journey took about 24 hours from Chennai, which is where I lived with my grandmother, to Bombay, to Mumbai. So we used to travel by train. And now she was going on a longer trip, so she couldn't leave Divine Mother alone in the house. So I remember there was this woven bamboo basket and all these special cloths that were made specifically for this purpose, for Divine Mother, this particular deity, to travel with us. And when we traveled, when we carried her, we had to observe certain rules. She had to be placed at a certain time into this basket. And then when we reached my uncle's place in Mumbai, she had to be ceremoniously brought out and find her place there. And now she was going to live there for whatever time we spent there, whether it was 7 days or 10 days or whatever, however long that period was. And then when that was done, again, she was going to travel back with us in the train back to Chennai to my grandmother's place. Now, all of these, from the outside, from the rational point of view or Western ways of thinking, it might look like are these imaginations or constructs of the human mind. They are and they are not. They simply are not. When we become more and more attuned to the subtler spiritual realities, we realize that these truths that we hold on to are our only way of perceiving realities that are outside of the senses. These are the only doorways for us to be in tune with subtler and subtler revelations of truth. So it is important for us to be able to respect them, just as Totapuri did finally after that incident, to understand what these symbols are and to tune into them, because they were created, they were given to us for our own spiritual benefit. So attachment to form is not an impediment to spiritual progress in this case. It did not hold back Ramakrishna. It did not hold back saints of any great religion. So those of us who are watching this, unless we find ourselves to be more spiritually evolved than them, forms are not an impediment. Attachment to them does not hold us back spiritually. Now I'm going to move on to discuss further chapters. I'm going to skip a few, but there are some important concepts that we will go through. Now, as we were talking about symbols and revelations, it's important for us to also sort of get some perspective and timing, because this, again, is a very common question and a conundrum when somebody is working with Indian religion and Sanatan Dharma and history of Hinduism and all of that. Where does all of this originate? And it actually ties back to the discussion that we were having about symbol just a few minutes ago. Now, modern science, evolutionary history, and Western science often define civilization in a way that we are constantly on this ascending cycle. That somehow where we stand, this moment in history where I'm speaking with you through this computer screen, is the apex of human civilization. That man evolved from apes, and then there was Stone Age, and then there was, whatever other ages that there were. I don't know quite history that well, but somehow we have been in this constant cycle of upward and upward evolution, which implies that everything from now on is going to be better, and this moment is the apex of human civilization and human history on this planet. Now, in that particular light, all of what we have been discussing so far with the symbols and truths expressed and preserved in Sanatan Dharma, all these forms of the divine, the images given to us by the ancient rishis, we have to question them. If this is the apex of civilization, don't we know more now in 2021, which is when I'm speaking to you, than people did 500,000, 2,000 years ago? Why are we looking back at them if they were less developed and less civilized than all of us? Shouldn't we be discovering and presenting more symbols as we know and understand reality today? Now, the answer to that is no, because that idea, this assumption which Western science presents almost as a fact, as Swamiji explains here, and as Sanatan Dharma and all great religions tell us, is one of the greatest delusions of the human mind. It is the delusion of the rational mind, because we try to understand everything in terms that we know to be true through our senses, and our understanding of reality where we stand right now is limited by things that we know and limited by things that we don't know. So our own limitations and understanding cannot give us the power to declaratively say what truth is and what truth isn't. Now, I don't want to get on a philosophical discussion about that. Where this leads us to is the discussion on the yugas. Now, I'll link in the comments once this is over, because it's already not there, a link to one of my talks on yugas and what they mean, these progressions of time, as Yogananda ji describes it in the autobiography of a yogi, if you're unfamiliar with it. But in essence, what Paramhansa Yogananda talks about in the autobiography is time itself as being cyclical, that we go through, those residing on this planet, we go through these cycles of upward and downward movements in human consciousness, of culture and civilization rising and dropping. And in this long, long cycle, we are in an ascending period right now, and the period that we are in is called Dwapara Yuga. And we just came out 200 years ago from a much darker period called Kali Yuga. This whole cycle is 24,000 years. So it's very, very long. And there are 4 periods of time. The highest age is called Satya Yuga, which is called the golden age, where human consciousness is very evolved and very close to divine realization. The next highest age is called Treta Yuga, where humans are again very in tune with each other on the level of thought and the level of ideas. And then comes Dwapara, which is the age that we are living in right now, where humans are more sophisticated than simply needing to work with matter. They can manipulate energy. And as you can see in the world today, that's where that's a living reality that we are all seeing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in science and electricity and magnetism and atomic power and all of that, or simply just how we as a community, as a society, are now breaking barriers and boundaries through advancements in technology. So that is indicative of that rising age that we are in, because if you remember 200 years ago, matter was the ultimate reality. One couldn't just traverse the globe easily, or you couldn't communicate with somebody who was living in a different part of the globe without electricity. One couldn't accomplish so many things that we so easily do as part of our daily lives. So that's just a very brief introduction on the yugas. I'm not going to go into that subject as part of this series. As I said, I'll link a video below if you want to learn more about that. And you can also find more information both in the autobiography of a yogi and also another book titled The Yugas, written by two very astute and intelligent authors. Their name is Steinmetz and Selby. You can find that through Crystal Clarity Publishers easily on Amazon. That's a book I would highly recommend if you want to study more of that subject. But all of this becomes important to our discussion on symbols and mythology and Hinduism, because in this way of understanding, in this understanding of reality as time being cyclical, we do acknowledge that there were in fact higher civilization. There was a higher and more refined understanding of truth in the past as well. We may not be able to relate to all of it or be able to see how they arrived at it from where we are standing, because our understanding here is not refined enough. Swami quotes this very interesting joke with ants when talking about the subjects. He says, when one ant describes to another ant this reality of an elephant, then the other ant simply dismisses it, saying this is just a dramatic exaggeration. It cannot be far from truth. Can you prove it to me? Can you show me what an elephant is, or can you prove that it exists? Now, an ant's dismissal of the idea of an elephant is not all that different from the Western civilization's idea or dismissal of the idea that civilization could have been more advanced in the past. Of course, even if it was more advanced, we will not have ways to necessarily understand or tune into it, because our refinement and awareness where we stand right now is not developed enough. Now, I cannot go further into it. If it's not something that you can subscribe to, that is totally fine. We can keep it aside for right now, but it is one of the essential teachings of Sanatan Dharma. In fact, Swami goes on to say, when archaeologists are presented with this idea that civilization could have been more advanced, then the first question that they ask is, can you show me proof? Can you show me tools that prove that ancient civilizations were more advanced? What kind of devices they had? What kind of tools did they develop? Now, the question itself is inherently flawed, because it is trying to understand that civilization with the same materialistic point of view that we hold right now, that somehow advancement itself is defined by how much people do things the way we do it right now. Whether it's using tools or technology or achieving what we want to achieve through the means of manipulating the physical plane. So in that sense, of course, we do not have proof of those tools, because those tools perhaps were not needed in a higher civilization. Because if we were to look at all of this from this point of view, with this ultimate goal of human life itself as the pursuit of happiness, then the refinement or the advancement of a civilization is defined by how effectively were people in that period, in that civilization, able to tune into that goal and make progress towards that goal of seeking that ultimate happiness. That should be the measure, not of whether they developed tools to do this or that, whether they had skyscrapers, whether they had computers, whether they had, modern technology or Wi-Fi routers or whatever it is that we think of as advancement in this day and age. And let's look at the world around us. Whatever it is that denotes civilization, whether it's tall buildings, congested highways, nightclubs or computers, whatever it is that we see, they, if we tune into the spiritual reality of things, we know for a fact are not necessarily taking us closer to that ultimate goal of finding happiness. So it is only obvious that if there was a civilization or a time when humans were more advanced, then they would be closer to that understanding of where true happiness lies and how to reach there. So they may not need all the things that we consider to be material accomplishments in this day and age. Now, all of this becomes important to us because we then are able to tune into the past. We can take positive elements from those higher states, those higher civilization, because all of the scriptures of Sanatan Dharma, whether it's the Vedas, whether it's the Mahabharata, Ramayana, all these great scriptures and teachings, they do come from this higher age. In fact, Swami talks a lot about history and this particular author named Graham Hancock, where he describes how you can see common threads between all civilization that exists today in language and symbolism, as we know in all great world civilization, whether it's the Indian, Greek, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and all of those. Simple things like in all cultures, the word for mother starts with the sound ma. However differently you say it in different languages, it seems like they all trace themselves back to the same root. Or the days of the week, the Sunday is dedicated to the sun god. How is it possible that if people from the West, from Greece and Europe, did not arrive in India until the 10th or the 12th or the 16th century, how did we both have the same names and the same conception of the days of the week even before that time? How is that possible? Now, there are a lot of theories proposed here, and the one theory that Swami talks about is how everything descended from one high world culture, as Graham Hancock describes in his book. That's the book that Swami quotes here. So all of this, the roots for all of this can be traced back to one culture, which again spread throughout the world in a different level of civilization at a different time, which we may not have as part of documented history today as science reveals it to us, but there was perhaps a more advanced civilization at a time when this was all one collective culture, and from there come all these common symbols and terms. Now, as Swami says, Hancock somehow puts Antarctica as the place. I don't quite know the rationale or how he describes all of this as the place where that civilization existed. And Swamiji, of course, says the civilization has to have been the Indian civilization, whether or not the Indian map looked like this, whether or not even the world looked like what it's looking like today, because there were so many tectonic shifts. Where we have the Himalayan mountains today, there was this large sea called the Tethys, and Africa and India were joined together, and there was just a lot of different things happening over millions of years. Now, in a different high civilization, perhaps all of these can be traced back to the same origin. Now, when we say that this perhaps is the root of Sanatan Dharma and Indian culture, as it is preserved in the Indian subcontinent even today, it is not to say that one culture is more superior than the other, or one group of people are more spiritual than the other. If we were to read it that way, that would be a big mistake. That's not what we are trying to say. It is simply all people are spiritual. It's not like spirituality is confined to one particular land or one particular culture, but it is simply that the Indian civilization throughout these tests of time has been able to preserve the essence of these high teachings without them being disguised or diluted. And that is why it gives us easy ways to access these teachings and truths more easily. All great religions start from that same root idea. All scriptures, whether it's the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, they are talking about the same truth. It's not that one is better than the other. It's not like one God is better than the other God. To think of one civilization as being superior or one group of people as being more spiritual is as good as saying one scripture is better than another scripture. That is not true. They are just different expressions of the same one truth. It's not like one is better than the other. But there is a certain truth that in the Indian culture and the way it is held, it has been able to retain the essence of Sanatan Dharma more effectively. This goes back to where we started our first week, where we quoted Yogananda ji as saying, India is the guru of this planet. I'm going to read one more quote by Yogananda ji, which kind of summarizes what I was just talking about. This is a direct quote from Paramhansa Yogananda. India alone among the great world religions preserved the deeper spiritual teachings undisguised and undiluted. It was able to do so precisely because religion in India was never formally organized. It had no priestly hierarchy. So Yogananda ji here is going back to that same idea where we started the series with, of what religion itself was. And because religion was not institutionalized on a large scale in India, it is not to say that there are no religious institutions in India. There do exist a lot of religious institutions, but the idea or the conception of spirituality and religion was not put into that strong hierarchy that all the other world religions fell into. And because of that reason, the Indian subcontinent has been able to preserve this over this long period of time, perhaps from a higher civilization itself. And these teachings come from an undivided line, constantly revitalized by mystics over and over again that were born in the Indian subcontinent. Again, there have been mystics and saints in all different cultures. The reason why the others have not been as effective in preserving the essence is because they fell prey to this temptation of institution. If you think of the Christian religion, of course the Christian religion came from Jesus Christ, who himself was an avatar, and it's a true religion. But the Gnostics, who were more contemplative and who were in tune with the spirit of Jesus' teachings, soon, right after Jesus passed away in a few hundred years, they were completely sidelined, and the establishment of the church and the theologians took over the religions away from the mystics. And the mystics not only were sidelined, they were penalized and they were ostracized. And the same thing with Islam or the Muslim religion, where the Sufis, who express a more freer expression of mystic revelation and understanding, they're sidelined from the mainstream religion. Now again, this is not a critique or judgment on any of the world cultures or religion, but it's important for us to understand that the power of experience, the power of revelation, the power of truth itself has to be at the core of religion and of spirituality. When that core is placed in an institution, in a hierarchy, in a theology, then over time, the seed that gave the religion the power is soon lost. And thankfully, Sanatan Dharma in India, as it has been preserved by the culture, has not lost its seed because of its diversified nature, because of how somebody might think this great saint or this head of the Shankaracharya of this institution is the Pope of Hindu religion. Somebody else thinks this particular modern day guru is the Pope of the Hindu religion. And everybody defines their own reality, their own relationship with spirituality, with spiritual authority, and they get to do that, which gives Hinduism this flavor, this diversification and heterogeneous nature, which allows for mystical understandings to both survive and for people to be drawn to it more organically. And that's why Sanatan Dharma, over this very, very long trajectory of time, has been able to preserve itself in the Indian subcontinent. I wanted to discuss a few more things today, but I think we are reaching the end of our time together. I'm not going to launch into the next topic because I won't be able to complete it this evening. So I was hoping to share more stories, but it ended up being a little more philosophical than what I wanted it to be. Perhaps next week we'll pick it back up from where we left and look at more stories, not just from Indian mythology, but more importantly, from the lives of mystics and saints, not just Yogananda, but all great Indian saints, because they contain the essence and the core of all the teachings of Sanatan Dharma. So I really do enjoy sharing this and hearing from all of you. So feel free to write to me. I think it's very helpful. Please free to share your thoughts. I'm not even sure I'm the most qualified to be answering all the questions I receive. Perhaps some of you have even better answers than the ones I have. So I would love to hear anything that you have to say. This class is only scheduled until end of the month of July, just one more Wednesday when I'll be discussing the next chapter in the book. After that, I do want to continue discussing this book because I'm realizing how both dense and useful this is as a discussion topic for all of us. So I hope to launch a Zoom class series where some of us can get together and study this book together. You will hear more about that. I'm going to get some of those details together before next week and I'll share with you. If you're interested, if there are enough people interested, then we will figure out some regular cadence of holding this class in a different format, perhaps not on live stream or Facebook, but on a more control platform like Zoom, where all of us can look at each other and share, and we will pick up one particular theme or one particular story from the Hindu faith, Hindu mythology. We explore it together based on the teachings of self-realization, and we are able to have discussions around that. So more on that later. Wonderful sharing this evening with all of you. I'll see you next week. Until then, God bless you.